As well as bombing Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese launched a war of conquest across Asia to snatch for themselves essential raw materials. The British colonies of Malaya and Singapore were prime targets, Malaya producing 70% of the world's rubber and vast quantities of tin, while Singapore had a magnificent naval base. Landing in southern Thailand and northern Malaya, British resistance was confused and sporadic. Due to the pressures of fighting the Germans and the Italians in Europe and North Africa, the Far Eastern theatre had been starved of modern aircraft, ships and weapons, leaving British troops at a disadvantage. The Japanese pushed steadily south, and the British pulled back to new defence lines time again, until January 1942, when an opportunity arose to hold the Japanese up properly. But the British lacked one essential item of modern warfare: tanks, while the Japanese had plenty. On the 4th of January 1942, the exhausted British and Indian troops fell back to a new defensive position at Slim River. The position at Slim River offered some hopes of stopping the Japanese advance. For several miles north of the river, the railway and trunk road ran parallel to each other through a belt of rubber plantations only 4 miles wide. To the east was rough mountain country, and to the west jungle and swamp. The nature of the terrain would funnel any Japanese attack into a clear killing field. The British defence was based on 2 infantry brigades placed one in front of the other. The formal edge of the position was held by the 12th Indian Infantry Brigade, based on Trolac village. 5 miles south was the 28th Indian Infantry Brigade along the north bank of the Slim River and Slim village itself. Each brigade contained 2 Indian battalions and 1 British battalion. The British still had plenty of field artillery, but was very short of anti-tank guns after the earlier fighting, and the 12th Brigade had only 3 guns and the 28th 2. The infantry battalions were all under strength following protracted fighting. 12 Brigade consisted of the 2nd Battalion, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, a very distinguished old Scottish regiment, and 2 Indian battalions, the 5th 2nd Punjabis and the 4th 19th Hyderabad's. The Argylls had a platoon of Lanchester Armoured Cars, armed with the Boy's anti-tank rifle. The Indians occupied positions ahead of the Argylls, spread out by companies for miles down the railway line and the trunk road. The road had been modernized and straightened, a series of loops left to grow back to nature, but the Japanese were fully aware of these loops, which they would use to their advantage later. The railway line had been blocked by demolishing a bridge. The British only possessed 3 dozen anti-tank mines in the entire position. By late afternoon on the 6th of January, the Japanese began to close up on the position. An attack was expected the next day. The Hyderabad's were ordered to withdraw through the Punjabis and the Argylls after dawn to create space, preventing the Japanese from encircling the first units. But the British mistimed the move. The Japanese were much closer than they thought, and they possessed tanks. Japanese infantry had begun to move onto the British flanks into the mountainous and jungle country the British thought impassable. They intended to cut the trunk road behind the Argyll's position at Trolac village. But the going was very slow and extremely hard. The Japanese commander, Colonel Ando, was becoming impatient. Major Toyosaku Shimada, the senior tank officer in the unit, suggested a bold move. He would emulate the German blitzkrieg tactics and send his tanks straight down the trunk road to smash through the British and reach the Slim River Bridge before it could be blown. Shimada's plan was approved, and he set off with No. 4 Company's 6th Tank Regiment with 10 Type 97 medium tanks and 5 Type 95 light tanks of No. 1 Company and an infantry company and engineering platoon in lorries. Shimada doubted the British could stop him, and in this he was basically right. The Hyderabad's, still in position and awaiting dawn before withdrawing, were suddenly assailed by Japanese mortar and artillery fire at 0330 hours on the 7th of January. Half an hour later, a column of Japanese tanks with infantry support drove towards the 1st Company, firing as they moved. One tank was knocked out by an anti-tank gun. Shimada swung his column into one of the old overgrown road loops and outflanked the Indians. The Hyderabad's broke contact and started withdrawing through the jungle. 0430, Shimada's tanks ran into the Punjabis' forward company. One tank was disabled by a mine, but Shimada's 80 infantry jumped from their trucks and attacked. They were soon pinned down in heavy fighting. The Japanese tanks moved on alone, cutting into another abandoned road loop, bypassing the Punjabis' battalion headquarters. The Japanese tanks emerged amongst the reserve company. An anti-tank gun knocked out one tank and mines disabled another, while a third had a track shot off using anti-tank rifles. But the Punjabis were overwhelmed and destroyed, some 70 British officers and Indian troops trying to regain their own lines. Most were subsequently captured. Because the British had lost so much signal equipment earlier in the campaign, 12th Brigade relied on the civilian telephone system to communicate. The Japanese cut the wires at 0500. The Argylls therefore had no idea what was happening ahead of them. They had improvised a roadblock covered by 2 armoured cars at Trolac, along with an ambush party armed with Molotov cocktails. At 0530, 4 Type 97s appeared and engaged the roadblock. Petrol bombs burst over the leading tank but did no damage. The armoured cars did what they could but were smashed to pieces and knocked out. A small road bridge had been prepared for demolition, but a Japanese officer had cut the wires to the chargers with his sword. 30 minutes later, the Japanese attacked Trolac village. This attack was repulsed by battalion headquarters personnel and drivers. More Japanese tanks and infantry arrived. At 1000, the Argylls decided to fall back to Slim River Station through the jungle. A company was ambushed, but almost wiped out a Japanese company on the railway line. Company D knocked out the leading Japanese Type 95 using an armoured car. The remains of the Hydeраbads now joined the Argylls to withdraw, but by now the Japanese had cut off the line of retreat. The Argylls fought desperately until various companies tried to break out. Some made it, including 90 men and 2 armoured cars that fought in the final battles at Singapore. Major Shimada had been joined by the rest of his tanks and now moved south. Brigadier Selby, commanding officer of the 28th Infantry Brigade, had been informed of the disaster that was befalling the 12th Brigade ahead of him. He dispatched the 5th 14th Punjabis north to help. Then he sent the 2nd 1st Gurkha Rifles east to cover the road bridge. At 0800, Major Shimada's tanks smashed into the 5th 14th Punjabis. The 2 leading companies were cut to pieces. The rest of the battalion retreated into rubber plantations and fought Japanese infantry. Shimada kept moving, shooting up 28 Brigade's only troop of anti-tank guns, which the Japanese caught driving to support the Punjabis. The tanks swung east at Slim River Station, straight through the 2nd 9th Gurkha Rifles, then smashed into the marching column of the 2nd 1st Gurkha Rifles. So many were killed, captured or missing that next day the battalion could muster only 5 officers and 20 other ranks. Moving on, Shimada came upon 2 batteries of 137 Field Regiment, Royal Artillery, parked beside the road. The tanks raked the gunners and their guns, then shot up a field ambulance unit. Shimada was now only 1 or 2 miles from the vitally important Slim Road Bridge over the river. Defending it was one troop of 1-6 Light Anti-Aircraft Battery Royal Artillery, with Bofors 40mm guns. They opened up on the Japanese tanks from 100 yards, but the flak shells did not damage the Japanese tanks and the British gunners were shot down. The tanks drove across the bridge. Shimada left one tank to guard the bridge and drove on for 2 more miles. Then he ran into 155 Field Regiment Royal Artillery that was driving towards the front. The tanks smashed the first few limbers and their artillery before someone managed to get a 4.5-inch howitzer into action. Opening up at 30 yards, the leading Japanese tank was blown to pieces. At this point, Shimada knew that his luck had run out. He retired to the bridge where the British shelled him for the rest of the day. But Shimada's armoured charge had cost him only 6 tanks. The British had lost 4,000 men, most of them captured. 33 artillery pieces, 15 anti-tank guns, 6 anti-aircraft guns, 50 armoured cars and tracked Bren gun carriers, and 550 motor vehicles. 12th Infantry Brigade was destroyed, and 28th Brigade was no longer fit for action. The defeat at the Slim River cost Britain Central Malaya, hastening the eventual British withdrawal to Singapore Island for the final battle with the Japanese. Sadly, this disaster, and so many others in Malaya, were occasioned by not only a shortage of anti-tank weapons, but by the fact that the British possessed not one single tank in the whole of Malaya. The Japanese tanks may have been laughably small and undergunned, but they had proved devastating against an enemy that possessed no effective countermeasure. Major Shimade's aggressive and daring handling of his little tanks won for the Japanese victory out of all proportion to the forces deployed. Its ramifications had very far-reaching consequences for Britain in Asia, as well as the ultimate course of the war in the Far East. Please subscribe and share, and also support my channel via PayPal and Patreon, details below.